Sheriff on the Spot by Peter Field. Chapter 1. A kerosene lantern hung from a nail in the wall and lit the interior of the small lean-to at the rear of the adobe jail in Dutch Springs. The lean-to contained a canvas cot, an old rocking chair, and a small wooden table that served as a desk. In Dutch Springs and throughout Powder Valley, the lean-to was known as the sheriff's office. Tonight, a roll of bedding, neatly wrapped in a tarp and tied with a short piece of rope, lay on the canvas cot. The top of the table was clean, and the wooden floor had been meticulously swept. Pat Stevens stood in the center of the floor and let his gray eyes brood over the cramped interior, checking everything to make sure that he was leaving nothing behind. For Pat was bowing out as sheriff of Powder Valley. He was turning over the keys to the jail, to the lean-to office, and his badge to his successor. And that reminded Pat of something, and he reached up and slowly unpinned the badge from his gray flannel shirt. The yellow light from the lantern gleamed on it brightly as he held it in his hand. He laid the badge on top of the table and let out a sigh. He grinned at himself ruefully for that sigh. A man would think he was sorry to be giving the badge up. Nothing could be further from the truth. He hadn't wanted to be sheriff in the first place. The job had been thrust upon him after Ed Grimm's murder. Someone had to take hold and see that law and order in the valley was maintained, and the choice had naturally fallen upon him because of his past reputation. With his two gun partners, Sam, SLOAN, and EZRA, as deputies, he hadn't made Powder Valley a bad sheriff, but he was glad enough to give the badge up. He was wondering why Jeff Purdo didn't come along, and he was settling himself impatiently in the rocking chair to wait for him. Jeff had promised to come in the afternoon to take over the office. Now it was early night, and still Jeff hadn't showed up. Through an open window behind him, Pat Stevens could hear the evening stage coming down Main Street at a gallop, and could hear the shouts and the jangling of harnesses as it slowed for a brief stop in Dutch Springs before coming on southward. It was kind of funny that Jeff Purdo hadn't come. He had been anxious enough to get the job Pat was giving up. Of course, it wasn't really legal turning the office over to him tonight. Jeff couldn't officially be sworn in as sheriff until the next day, but then his appointment maybe wasn't exactly legal either. None of the local citizens knew what the correct procedure was when a sheriff resigned. It had looked like a lot of time and trouble to hold another election, so a group of representative men had gotten together and talked it over and decided upon Jeff Purdo. Powder Valley had its own way of simplifying legal matters, and it generally seemed to work out just all right. Pat hoped that Jeff would be the right man to take over. He rather liked Jeff, though the incoming sheriff was rather new to the valley, having settled on a ranch south of town only about 6 months prior. Still, Pat thought that might be a good thing as a sheriff. Might be better to be a sheriff not too intimately acquainted with the folks. He'd have a better chance to be impartial and run the office as it ought to be run. The way Powder Valley was growing up and getting civilized, it was the time the sheriff's office was put on some strictly business basis. Pat turned his head and listened to the cracking whip and the clatter of wheels as the stagecoach pulled out. Dutch Springs was getting to be a real hub of transportation, with the new coach each direction, and being selected as a station point for the new Pony Express line that would soon be bringing mail up the southern route to connect with the eastern west line north of Denver. That would be a mighty fine thing for the valley. Bring Dutch Springs into close contact with the outside world. And it was going to be a mighty fine thing for EZRA and Sam, SLOAN too, with them getting the contract to run the local Pony Express station. As a mail rider, small, wiry Sam SLOAN would certainly be one of the most competent and trustworthy men in the service, and EZRA, he was a mighty fine hand with horses. It was the sort of work they needed to quiet them down and keep them out of trouble. Ever since they upped and sold their Powder Valley ranch at auction and gone trapezing off over on the crazy adventure to Corpse's Corner, Pat Stevens had been worried about the pair. He had helped them get their $8,000 back after losing it in a crooked poker game, and had been able to argue them into returning to the valley with them, but both of them had refused to go back to ranching. With all that cash money, they had been living like a couple of bank presidents up in the Jewel Hotel, drinking too much and paying too much attention to pretty Kitty Lane, who was entertaining in the Jewel Saloon and presiding over the dining room. That is, Sam Sloan was hopelessly smitten by Kitty. Ezra, with his scarred face and one eye and his huge, ungainly body, had always left women strictly alone. But Sam was making a plumb fool of himself, according to what Pat's friends told him. Pat wasn't so sure. Kitty Lane was mighty pretty, and the men did say that she wasn't one for foolishness. Oh, she'd sing for a man and flirt when he danced with her and let him buy her a drink now and then, but she wouldn't let it go no further than that. At least, that was the story told by men who had tried. Pat hadn't been seeing much of Sam and Ezra while he was sheriff. They deeply resented the badge he wore, and that was one reason why he'd be glad to turn it over to Jethro. He wondered again, why hadn't Jethro come along? And he got up to step to the window and peered out towards the village. Brisk footsteps coming up the plank walk to the office brought Pat Stevens' head around slowly. He blinked at the man who stopped in the doorway and peered inside. The stranger was dressed in dudish city clothes, a stiff straw hat and neat gray suit, a cloth top and button shoes with very sharp toes. He wore a celluloid collar and tie with a big gold horseshoe stick pin, and he carried a pair of fawn-colored gloves in his left hand. He was a slender man, with dark pouches under a pair of coldly cruel eyes, and he wore a neatly clipped black mustache. When he parted his thin lips to address Pat, 3 gold teeth glinted in the yellow lamplight. He studied Pat with his head cocked sideways on one side and said, "So, you're the sheriff here in Powder Valley, huh?" His words seemed to carry a covert sneer with them, and Pat replied, "Howdy," and just let it go at that. The stranger stepped inside and glanced around the lean-to. "Just moving in, huh? Well, it's time. I've waited long enough for you fellers to get rid of that other sheriff. You know who I am, of course," he went on impatiently when Pat didn't say anything. Pat cleared his voice and admitted, "I'm not rightly sure that I do." "I'm Ralston. Fred Ralston. Just pulled in from Denver on the coach. I thought I'd drop by and see for sure that we had the right sheriff in office before I go on up to the Jewel. Kitty wrote me that Dems had it all fixed up with you. You know exactly what you're to do?" Pat replied mildly, "Mr. Dems don't generally make mistakes, does he?" "Not him," Fred Ralston chuckled. He glanced down at the silver badge laying on the table. "Don't be forgetting to pin that on when you come over. We gotta make this look pretty legal." Pat replied grimly, "I'll be wearing it." The man from Denver unbuttoned his coat and dragged a big, heavy watch out of his waist pocket by means of a gold chain. He snapped it open and said, "Give me about half an hour. The less I'm seen around town, the better the affairs always go." "This seems like old stuff to you."
"Yeah, sure." Ralston chuckled and put back his watch. "Kitty and I worked it out plenty before. Don't you worry. She'll have things fixed just right. She tells me she hooked a real fish this time. $8,000 in hard cash. Him and his partner together.
Ralston smacked his lips over the words. Pat Stevens' mind was working desperately, trying to think over things to say that would keep the city man talking without revealing to him that he wasn't Jeth Prideaux. The only two men in Dutch Springs with $8,000 was Sam SLOAN and EZRA. He knew that they must be the pair that Ralston was referring to, but what did he mean by Kitty had hooked into them? None of the conversation made any sense yet, and he tried desperately to steer it around to something concrete that would dispel the mystery. "You reckon he's not going to make any trouble, him and his partner?"
"Trouble?" Ralston laughed scornfully. "Not if you do your part."
Pat got out a red bandana and mopped the sweat from his bronzed forehead, though a cool breeze swept over him from the open window, and he mumbled, "I ain't so sure I rightly know what my part is."
"Nonsense," Ralston said briskly. "Do exactly as Dems has told you. Now, I'd better be getting over there before they wonder what's become of me."
He nodded briskly and then walked out. Pat Stevens stood unhappily by the window and wondered what that was all about. Joe Dems was a proprietor of the Jewel Hotel, a Saturn man who had recently come to Dutch Springs and took over the old run-down hotel. With Kitty Lane acting as a magnet for the ranchers and punchers of Powder Valley, the old hostelry was coming to life in surprising manner under Dem's expert handling. Grizzled family members who had never spent a night away from home in their lives suddenly found reasons for spending the night in Dutch Springs, and the younger cowhands crowded there with enthusiasm every night for the chance to dance with Kitty to the music of an accordion and an untuned piano. But how did that all affect Sam SLOAN and the $8,000 that he and EZRA had gotten from the sale of their ranch? Pat was a simple man with no experience at unraveling mysteries. He and EZRA and Sam had done more than their share to unmask lawlessness in the West, but it had all been kind of a direct manner to be settled with a blazons of 6 guns. He didn't know anything about the ways of city slickers. He was certain that Fred Ralston had something up his sleeve, but he didn't quite know sure how to go about shaking it out into plain sight. It was evident, though, that the plan required help of the sheriff, and that the conspirators had been waiting for the time when Pat would step down and turn his badge over to Jeth Prideaux. Slow anger began to burn inside Pat at the thought. Prideaux had fooled him all right, just as he had fooled all the other honest citizens of the valley, planning some sort of deviltry his first night as sheriff, with Joe Dems, Kitty Lane, and a stranger from Denver. The hoofbeats of her galloping horse came through the open windows from the road leading south from Dutch Springs. The galloping was labored, as a horse straining to keep up with a pace that was spurred on by a relentless rider. Pat frowned and listened intently, and heard the horse swerve away from Main Street towards the small adobe jail and lean-to. He stiffened and turned from the window as the animal plowed to a stop outside. He heard the thud of hard boot heels on planks outside and the jingle of spurs. Jeth Prideaux came panting into the office, his thin red face tight with worry. He was a tall man with a greyhound leanness of a frame. He wore a single gun belt, carrying a .45 with big roweled Spanish spurs on his run-down boots. His face showed relief at the sight of Pat Stevens. "I was afraid you'd get tired of waiting," he panted. "I got hung up at the ranch. 2 of my best danged cows got bogged into Clay Creek. And then when I got started, damned if my horse didn't put his foot into a gosh darned prairie hole, and I had to shoot him and go back and rope another." He paused to catch his breath, and then ducked his head to step inside the lean-to. Pat asked, "What's all the hurry about?" "Well, you said how you wanted me to take over tonight and you'd be cleaning out. I didn't want you to get tired of waiting on me and leave town." Jeth glanced around the office, his gaze stopped at the badge on the table. clinging there as though its silver brightness hypnotized him. Pat said, "Seems like you're awfully anxious to start being sheriff." "Oh, 'tain't that. Just didn't want to be late." He paused and then asked with a elaborated show of unconcern, "Evening stage come in yet?" "Yeah, it's come and gone." There was a little moment of silence in the small lean-to. Pat stood on flat feet with his arms folded across his chest, little wrinkles around the outer corners of his eyes as he studied the face of the man who had been selected to succeed him as sheriff. Jethro shifted his weight from his right foot to his left, and he glanced at Pat's impassive face and said uncertainly, "Well, looks like you're all packed up and all. Nothing much left to do but this, I reckon." He took a step forward and reached down for the badge of office. "Hold on, Perdue." He spoke in a slow drawl, but with enough weight to cause Perdue to jerk back his hand and look around apprehensively. "What do you know about a feller named Fred Ralston?" Perdue wet his lips. "Didn't catch the name." "From Denver," Pat went on evenly. Fear leapt into Perdue's eyes, and he lowered them swiftly and muttered, "I don't know what you're talking about." "What you got planned with Joe Dems and Kitty Lane and this Ralston hombre?" Jeth Perdue began to shake his head from side to side. "I don't know what you're driving at." Pat said angrily, "Start talking, Perdue, and talk fast. Ralston came in on that stage tonight." Jeth Perdue took a backward step. A yellowish gleam flickered from behind his lowered eyelids. His right hand started stealthily downward towards the butt of his holstered gun. "Don't be trying it, Jeth." His arms were still folded. Perdue's gun hand went downward fast. Pat lunged forward and drove his fist across the point of the leaned man's jaw. Jeth toppled backwards off balance, desperately dragging for his gun to clear leather. Pat laughed savagely and pulled his own gun free and swung it downward in a sharp arc that smashed the heavy barrel against Perdue's wrist. Jethro sobbed with pain, his .45 clattering to the floor. He sank back in fear as Pat towered over him. "Start talking, you skunk," Pat ordered through teeth that were set hard. "Give it to me before I go to start gun whipping you right." Jeth whined. "I don't know nothing. As God is my judge, Pat, I don't know what you're jumping me for." "You lie! It's something about Sam and Ezra." Jeth Perdue moaned. "You busted my wrist to short of hell." He caught hold of it with his left hand and cried out sharply with the pain of it. His face took on a queer pallor, and he sank down limply on the floor and lay there with closed eyes. Pat stood over him, cursing him, but he didn't move. Pat hesitated, and then shrugged, reholstered his gun. He stooped forward, got his hands underneath Perdue's shoulders, and dragged him over the threshold and around to the open door of the empty adobe jail. He pushed him onto the floor and let him lay there in a limp heap and closed the barred door and padlocked it securely. He walked back into the lean-to and kicked Jethro's gun into the corner and then picked up the silver badge and dropped it into a shirt pocket. He turned down the lantern and gave it a quick shake to put it out, and then went out and closed the door behind him. He figured it had been about half an hour since Fred Ralston's visit as he started towards the Jewel Hotel. End of Chapter 1.